met Layne at a house party, I think, in West Seattle, I believe. And I'd never met him before, but I'd seen his band. And I remember the first time I heard him sing, I was like, man, that guy's cool. You know, that guy's got a great voice. I would love to be in a band with that guy. We ended up actually meeting not long after that, a couple months after that. They played a show in Tacoma and I went to see it. Layne's guitar player at the time had met me and brought me over to the party, and I ended up meeting Layne, you know, just coming out of basically my whole world kind of blowing up after coming back from Texas. And he worked at a place called the Music Bank, which was like a rehearsal hall, and it was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and like 40 some rooms. Like, you know, like it was awesome. It was one of the coolest things ever. But basically, you know, we just kind of crashed there. He worked there, you know, worked a shift of letting bands in and out of their rooms, like when they were doing gigs or whatever, and then lock everything up and make sure that everything's secure. He met me at that party and we hit it off, and he's like, man, Nick was telling me about your situation, man. If you got nowhere to stay, you can come stay with me. I can probably even get you a job. And he did. So I basically moved in with him at the Music Bank, which was underneath the Ballard Bridge. And I got a job with Layne. Layne would work one shift, I'd work another, and there was basically maybe 4 or 5 of us that would kind of split shifts and kind of lived at the place. Each one of us got part of our pay. What a scam. We didn't get paid cash. We got a free room, and after a while of us complaining, the guy who ran the place, and the guy named Dave, he wouldn't give us, he might give us a couple of bucks here and there, but the fringe benefits were he'd smoke us out all the time, and then we complained enough, like, hey dude, we gotta eat, you know. So he started buying TV dinners, and I would never forget this. He had like all our names on a graph and like how many TV dinners you ate, and you had to put a little check mark every time you ate one, and a couple of us would cheat and not fucking put it in there, and by the end of the week, a couple of guys that were supposed to have dinners didn't have them, but we lived there until we started the band, pretty much, and that was 87, December of '87. We played our first show after being a band for like a couple of weeks. You know, the era we were kind of getting together in was kind of like the tail end of, you know, it was like a lot of mix of stuff, like, you know, the kind of 80s new wave to the LA strip kind of rock, you know, and then, you know, of course, you know, all of the English metal of the kind of 5 to 10 years before that. I think Layne's idea for the band that he had together and the way that he came up with the name, I think he and another guy came up with a name. They were trying to start a band that would play like kind of satanic speed metal, but dress in drag, you know what I mean? So it was like they were trying to get like a soft word and a hard word. So Alice in Chains, and kind of like a play on that. So I was kind of more like a classic rock and metal kind of background, and you know, Sean was into the Beatles and Duran Duran, and you know, Missing Persons, plus all the other rock as well, and then Mike was probably more, Starr was probably more in line with me, you know, like kind of classic rock and metal and stuff like that. But you know, when I started living with Layne at the rehearsal place, we would jam, and you know, he was really interested in what I was doing, and he knew I wanted to put a band together, but he already had a band. So I'm like, well, I'd just rather play with you. He's like, well, you know, I got my own thing, and he did. So you can't really argue with that. You know, I'm just like some kid moving up to the big city of Seattle from down south, and he already had his thing, and it was never that sort of a attitude or anything. It's just like, you know, he's got a band, I don't yet. So, you know, I wouldn't ask him to quit a band for what? I don't have anything yet. So, but he was always really supportive, and I just kept going at it. And before we got together as Alice, I'd met Mike on his own, then I'd met Layne on his own, and I started asking Layne about, you know, musicians, or you know, if you knew any other people that played or that would be cool to hang out with. And he's like, yeah, you know, I met this guy named Sean on Alki Beach like last year, and he was kind of a really funny dude, and said he played drums. I don't know how good he is, but he seemed like a pretty cool dude, you know, and I think I still have his number, and he did. So he gave me his number, and I called up Sean, and I'm like, you know, hey, I'm Jerry, and looking to kind of put together a band. You know, my buddy Layne says, you guys met, and yeah, you know, we're down here at the music bank. We got a room if you want to come down and jam. And he's like, yeah, that sounds cool. And he was asking me a few questions on like what I was into and stuff like that. He's like, yeah, I'll come down. He's like, you got a bass player? And I'm like, well, you know, I'm like, I don't. But he's like, well, what kind of bass player are you looking for? I'm like, well, you know, I played with this guy named Mike Starr for a couple of weeks. I thought he was pretty cool. Maybe somebody like that. You know who that is? I was like, yeah, I do know who that is. It's my best friend, and I'm dating his sister. So it's like, I'll bring him down too. So they came down, Mike and Melinda and Sean, they all came down, and we ended up jamming together. I think Layne was, you know, mildly interested, but he wasn't really involved, you know. But then he started kind of, you know, listening to us play a little bit, and we picked a couple of covers to play first, I think. Well, I think it was like Hanoi Rocks, like Taxi Driver or something like that, or Suffragette City, David Bowie. You know, Layne's had his band, which was which used kind of the same name, but it was more like Guns N' Roses, Alice in Chains instead of Alice in Chains. And then he had this other band with another dude named Ron, which was kind of more, I don't know, it was like kind of like Dead or Alive kind of stuff, like kind of, you know, kind of glammy goth kind of dance stuff or whatever, but still with some heavy guitars. And he's like, hey, I'm doing this thing with this other guy, and you want to play guitar in that, you know? And I'm like, if you want to play a couple of songs with Alice too, man, that'd be cool. I'm like, okay, that's cool. I'll do that for you, but why don't you sing with us too as well? So we made a deal with each other to jam on this third project between our two projects. And then after a period of time, Sean and Mike and I were like, we were kind of tired of that, and we kind of had, you know, you're cocky, and we're like, we're better than those fucking guys. You know what I mean? Like, you need to jump ship and come over here and play with us. And he's like, well, I don't really want to leave my thing and blah, blah, blah. And we're like, okay. So we're like, how do we get him to quit his other side projects or whatever? And we were like, well, let's just start trying out singers in his room that I'm living in, cold-blooded, you know. But you know, he couldn't really argue with it either. He wasn't really mad about it, but he was kind of a little irked, I think. But we put an ad like in the Rocket, the local music mag or whatever, where you know, band looking for blah blah blah, must have equipment, fucking, you know, all that shit, and so we had a couple of days where we had just had a parade of idiots coming into the room that were just horrible. One guy was like a male stripper. He was like bright red hair, and he had like the spandex and like the handkerchiefs all the way down to his feet, like a kind of a trying to be a knockoff David Lee Roth, but just horrible. Couldn't sing worth a shit. We tried a couple of guys out, and he was like the last one, and Layne was working working the desk, so these guys would walk through, and then he'd get to hear through the wall us kind of trying to play with him. And after that last dude, the male stripper guy, he came down and he's like, all right, I'm in. All right, I can't let you guys be playing with these fucking guys, man. Fucking, you know. And we're like, we weren't really serious, man. We just wanted to get you pissed off enough to join. He's like, well, you got me. Okay, I'm in. So he quit all his other bands, and that's how we started.